Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session. Thank you so much for just gathering the last little bits and pieces of energy to actually make it in such an early hour on the last day of publica. We really appreciate it. And special thanks to all the people in the colorful shirts. It's really fun to see from the stage. Also, thanks to Garnet for wearing the shirt that's honoring Steve Kovac.
Yes.
I heard. So we would like to start with a little bit of an introduction to who we are, just real briefly, and then we will basically have a discussion about critical making, and so on and so forth. So Garnet, would you like to start?
Sure. My name is Garnet Hertz. I work as a professor in Vancouver, Canada. I teach design, and I have my job title is Canada Research Chair of Design and Media Art, and as part of that, I research the role of technology and culture and art and design. And I work at a university called Emily Carr University of Design, of Art and Design, and I work with a lot of graduate students on developing alternative kind of developments around technology and prototyping different technologies, different products, and different artworks with students.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Regina Sipos. The weird family name comes from Hungary, and me as well. And so I'm currently working at the Technical University of Berlin, at the Institut für berufliche Bildung und Arbeitslehre. And we actually started a project that was funded by the European Union about a year and a half ago. I'm looking at my colleagues, which is titled Critical Making. And when we're looking at it in this project is kind of learning from makers about how they make critically or responsibly, and what industry and academia can learn from their collaborative practices of technology development. So we're looking at gender, open source hardware, and we're sorry, friends, we haven't seen each other in years, but hey. That's the magic of post-COVID Republica. And education is the third topic in our big research consortium. So today we are here because we were asking ourselves the question: what is this making? Where does it come from? And I also continuously ask myself the question: isn't making in itself supposed to be critical? If you open something that is supposed to be closed, aren't you kind of hacking it open? But first, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your because you have a really long experience with how the term making kind of came to be, and what that whole process was. So you have a couple of really interesting insights that I haven't heard before. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I kind of saw the whole term of maker emerge, and was in California at the time when it emerged around 2003. I had gone to graduate school. I moved from Saskatchewan. I was living in a city called Saskatoon. You can look it up, and it's a place. Well, it's a place where it's smaller, a bit more rural, a bit more like Siberia, a little bit. And I moved to Southern California, to the Los Angeles area, to go to grad school. And there were tons of interesting people that were there, but not a lot of community. So I had seen in New York City and in Chicago and San Francisco that there was a group called Dorkbot. Dorkbot was a group that had started out. I had done an exhibition with the guy who founded it, Douglas Repetto, who does electronic music, and he was at Columbia University. I moved to Los Angeles and thought, I want to meet people. This Dorkbot thing is brand new. I'll do Dorkbot in Los Angeles. So I started doing this, and this was before hackerspaces had really come to North America. So I started organizing events, and what was interesting is that and I had a friend in San Francisco, Karen Marcello, who does work with Survival Research Labs. They're an extreme robotics group. She was doing the events in San Francisco. I was doing the events in LA. And Dale Daugherty, the founder of Make Magazine, was a regular attender of the San Francisco events. And the editor-in-chief, Mark Fraunfelder, who came from Boing Boing, was in LA. And so it was interesting because we talked about they had this idea that they wanted to start a new kind of publication, kind of a book, kind of a magazine about people who build stuff for the fun of it. And they'd initially wanted to call it Hacks. So Make Magazine was initially called Hacks Magazine, but they changed it to be more approachable. And so they came up with the term maker. They first called the magazine Make. In the beginning, they had a Craft magazine and a Make magazine. The Craft magazine kind of died. Make magazine took off. Then Arduino came out and gave a big boost to Make magazine. Then 3D patents about 3D printing. Arduino came out around 2005 or so, 2003, 4, 5. And 3D printing patents expired around 2007, something like that. Big boom. So this maker stuff really took off with the energy of, I see it as the energy of Arduino, first kind of wave of maker stuff, and then 3D printing. And so it was quite interesting seeing them. It's not like Make ripped off the idea from Dorkbot, but they were very inspired by it. And many of the people who come to Dorkbot would end up in Make magazine initially. So it was interesting because I saw the emergence of this term, and except the events that we were doing at Dorkbot, I thought were a lot more interesting and they were more edgy. And this was for people who don't know, Make was a magazine, I should say, and an organization that was founded and published by O'Reilly Press. O'Reilly Press is the press that makes all the, the programming books with the animal on the front kind of thing, the woodcut, So they started publishing it, and but it was very kind of almost Disney-fied. Like the format of Maker was very much sanitized. It was made very family friendly, and took out those kind of chaos computer club kind of hacker subcultural components. Those things got edited out of it, and I thought that was kind of unfortunate because that was kind of the most interesting part. So yeah, that's sort of how it. That's how I see that term emerging, and I think it really brought together a lot of people, and brought together community, and formed. And this was, I saw it really emerging in California, and almost like a Californian emergence, which I found a little bit odd because I'd come from kind of a rural area of Canada, and then they were all like really excited about this term, and I was kind of like, I kind of missed the hacker component of it, and or the artistic component of it, or the part of it, why you're doing it or who you're doing it for, and the idea of Make magazine initially was that it was just, here's some cool stuff. Let's make a LED blink. And it was kind of like, or let's make a Yoda head on a 3D printer. And it was kind of like, yeah, but that's like, what's the fun in that? Or why are you building this stuff? Or just because you have these tools doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to revolutionize everything. The idea that the technology on its own has an ability to solve problems is actually an interesting question and really debatable. And so I was interested and so as the maker thing was emerging, I was kind of like loving and hating it a little bit. Because I have a background in design and a background in art and done Ars Electronica, Transmediale, different things like this. And so that was a perspective. I sort of had more a Transmediale kind of concept around it. And the kind of family-friendly thing was, I saw that as a step kind of backwards in some ways.
That is actually super interesting, because one of the things that we keep on debating in our consortium is that, okay, we'd like to see how makers make and how they make critically, and how we can help them, maybe think a little bit more about either the impact of the work that they're having, or just to be a bit more considerate about exactly like what can you use this for, without being the word that you kind of were dancing around, this techno-solutionist, in a techno-solutionist way, right? So just thinking that this technology is going to solve all the societal problems, so to say.
Yeah.
But what we are also trying to avoid, and these are really lengthy discussions that we're having, is what you said about, the origin of Make Magazine being for people or about people who build stuff for the fun of it. So we're actually really worried that by kind of maybe forcing the criticality or responsibility aspect onto making, we take the fun out of it.
Yeah, that's
something
true.
That should happen, right?
I mean, it is true in a lot of ways. And I mean, for me, it was... I was coming from the perspective that I had already seen other kind of critical design, like there's critical design from Dunn and Raby, which is a concept kind of around industrial design. There's adversarial robotics. There's a number of different terms that people use that. And critical making was one of them by a guy, Matt Ratto, that I really liked and thought was most interesting to sort of intervene in that. So I didn't invent that term, but I used the term and I sort of was interested in taking it over and applying it into the whole maker thing. But I think with technology, it's sort of like a techno-solutionism is the idea that, you add more technology and it makes things better. And often that's the case. And often faster technology does improve some things, but it also creates other problems. And so like if you get a really nice camera, it doesn't necessarily take better pictures. It helps you take better pictures, but on its own, it doesn't take pictures. You have to do it, and it's a tool. And I think Arduino or 3D printing and these kind of things are like cameras, and they don't necessarily provide content for what you're building. And so in the idea of critical making, I was interested in just looking at the world of, let's just say, 3D printers and Arduinos, and just interested in just saying, let's not forget about the background of the arts.
Right.
Like, let's not forget about what we've learned in design. Mm-hmm. It's not so much like trying to take the fun out of it. It's more like after you do your first 3D print, and after you make your first Arduino thing work, then it's kind of hard. Then it becomes a little bit more difficult. It's like, why am I doing this thing? Mm-hmm. And so it's like, is this like, and I mean, lots of people in the maker scene understand kind of the tech bro cliche of like a startup kind of product. That is understood really well in most hacker spaces and maker spaces. But there's also elements of art. There's elements of design or industrial design and stuff like that that are new and interesting things that have a lot to offer those environments like hacker spaces, maker spaces.
Can you give us a couple of examples of a critically made or critically engineered or critically designed something that you think could be maybe inspiring for those who haven't thought about going in a critical direction before?
Yeah, I mean, some simple examples are like I had made a safe that takes away people's phones, where it was kind of a joke because I at the time had 3 teenagers. I have lots of children. I had 3 teenagers, and we were always on our, and me included, was always on my phone. And I sort of had a fantasy of a technology to take away people's phones. And so I had built a safe that you put your phone into, and you, as a group, surrender your phones, and then you can't get them back. And it turns into a game of waiting to get your phone back. So in that case, I had used like sort of traditional product design, electronic product design, to do something that it wasn't like I was going to make this on Kickstarter. It's not a Kickstarter campaign, but it was more of an art project meant to, it makes people laugh a little bit, and that's okay. And so I think it could be fun, but it was also meant to be I mean, for me, it was a little bit sadistic because the project had just a bunch of bored teenagers around it all the time. It was great.
No.
It was just like teenagers that hated that they actually gave up their phone. And it was just really funny. For me, it was more just kind of, it was playing around with the idea that electronic products and devices can tell different stories. They don't necessarily need to tell a story about making money. They can tell, you can design a piece of electronics that can talk about your childhood, talk about your political views, talk about your lots of different things, fantasies. You can make all sorts of stuff from an alternate universe, if you'd like to, Wakanda technology or whatever. There's so many different things that you can do with technology, and so I guess I was wanting to push that artistic end of it and that almost a critical design component of it.
Mm-hmm. I would like to take this discussion maybe a little bit more into like a more direction of a more like maybe a situated intervention type thing. So, what does making or critical making really mean for the real world, right? So situated intervention was actually a direction that Matt Ratto decided to take critical making to from this scholarly practice that he had originally come up with. And I mean, what I personally find fascinating is what happens when real world people start making things kind of for themselves, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of my research is from Indonesia, and hi, Stephanie. And what I found particularly interesting is that some people said that for them making was really not about. There was actually a fab lab in Yogyakarta that was basically abandoned after a while because they didn't really know what to do with the tools. What came after exactly this first step of learning how to make it blink and how to 3D print things, but then what do you do with this after? What's the next step? Yeah. And so some Indonesian women actually started experimenting with making leather, for example, from different soybean leftovers, so that women in their own households could actually also start making leather. And it was very interesting when I was talking to my friend and research object. Sorry, this was a joke we made yesterday. Terrible wording. So my friend. And she said that what she found really interesting about this is that once you start working, developing your own solutions, you start realizing that you're not necessarily, let's say, dependent on a, on a big company or something. It's kind of, she almost framed it as kind of a survivalist thing, which we actually saw over COVID, right? That supply chains were breaking down, and then people started kind of making their own things and also making protective things for people on the ground. And so this is what I think is most fascinating for me in making, that you realize that you can make your own things and you're not dependent on someone else, right?
Yeah, and I think that the idea, I mean, I think making is a helpful idea in so many ways, because I have a sort of love-hate relationship with the concept of making, to be honest. Love it in some ways and not, I'm critical of it in other ways, I guess you could say. But in terms of making, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I forgot what I was going to say.
It's also, I actually wanted to just reflect on this, because we keep on using the word making as if it was an actual word, but it is a brand, right? So it's
and it was constructed as a brand, and I see that the critique of that was primarily over the Californian-ness of it, whatever that means. The fact, I love that over-ambitious and underqualified vibe that is in many hacker spaces is so good, and I love it. I absolutely love that, and I like to encourage, and actually that's what we specialized in Dorkbot. We'd specialize in people in their garages making a spacesuit or something, like literally, for real. We have people like this in Los Angeles. And America is a great resource for kind of nutballs. But I think that there's many ways that term making can be used, but it's useful as an interdisciplinary kind of glue a little bit between people from different disciplines. I think Make Magazine kind of took it a bit too far, but I think it is useful to have a term like maker that is between artists and designers, or a woodworker, or a table maker, or whoever. I think it's interesting in that perspective as a concept. Yeah, and I think it did a lot of things. I just think that we don't need to forget about the heritage of it doesn't erase the history of hacker camps or all that kind of stuff, and it's a little bit silly. Actually, for example, like Make Magazine never really even explored the history of German hacker scene. Like that seems like such an interesting area. So they were almost completely non-historical. So there was many things about it that I think that would have been so interesting. And then part of it was just me not liking the magazine. But hopefully, I think that concept of critique in making is useful. But it's more important, for me, it felt more important to have that in California.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so I think that actually when you took this idea from Matt Reddo and then started publishing about it, and you published the zines that were collecting all these different projects, I think that a lot of people who were making but didn't see themselves as this US Americanized version of maker really picked up on the idea. So I know, for example, Indonesian hackers, they have been saying, hey, we're not makers. This is literally part of our culture, the whole DIY, but also the open source and so on and so forth. So why are you calling us this? I know that Felipe Fonseca wrote about why the critical maker idea really resonated with him, because it was kind of opposed to this, again, this commercialized picture of a maker.
Yeah.
And so for us here, I think in Europe, it might be a little bit different because we have the history of the hacker spaces,
Sure, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
But I still think it's just a very interesting approach in that sense that it really resonated with those people who understood what the problem was.
It resonated with artists that were kind of on the fence about making, and other people that were interested in things like 3D printing, but didn't feel like it was maybe going to change everything in their life.
Right.
Those people those people I think found resonance in it. And I should say that I had made zine kind of publications that were sort of like this, that were, talking about, I had published a series of booklets that were kind of like an alternative make magazine that were called Critical Making. Yeah.
Right. So you had your zines, and we only have 4 more minutes to go. So I actually wanted to ask you about your new book.
Yeah, I have a book that's coming out from MIT Press in next spring. It's called Art and DIY Electronics. It's about how artists have been working with electronics for over 100 years, and how and why they use technology, and how they adapt, and different techniques. Sometimes people use technology in very resource-limited ways. Sometimes they have very little tools, and they use materials in a very creative DIY way. And sometimes DIY has many different kind of forms. So actually in this book, I've sort of like almost jumped on the term of DIY as a framework, and I tried to build out about a dozen different concepts that feed into that relate to why somebody would want to try to work with technology on their own, and not in a company, and not in a big sort of administrative structure. What's the advantages to working on your own with technology? So I tried to build that out, and I used examples over the past. Most of them are within the past 40 years. Most of the examples are between 1960 and the year 2000. So it's sort of historical media art kind of stuff and critical design stuff. But I explore how and why you'd want to work with technology, and what the advantages are.
Right. So that's the past, and you summarize it in the book, or some parts, that were interesting for you. What do you think is going to be the future of making, of critical making?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it depends on where you're located, but within North America, the Make magazine kind of died.
Yeah.
And Make magazine was, I think, a more significant force in North America than it was in Europe. But you see many spaces emerging, feminist, hacker spaces, different DIY bio spaces, all sorts of interesting stuff. I think the future is sort of those spaces continuing to develop, but in much more dispersed way. I think Make tried to bring those things together, and I think that was productive to help get spaces organized, and tools and open source stuff. But I see it more diverse now, and much more interested and embedded into those different communities, and less easy to summarize as like one thing. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with that idea, because I think that the whole, just this creating this almost fake idea of a maker movement that would be universal and just basically the exact same thing all over the world, it was never a viable thing.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to maintain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. I think we're done.
I think we're done.